with that, I reserve.
And welcome to Shaka Extra Time, a show that comes to you live every Tuesday. Today we'll be talking about a wide range of issues, but first, hello Shaka.
Hello Paul.
How are you?
You can't believe it, but I remain simple, easy, and awesome.
And I see your style is changing a little bit. You look, as usual, you look exquisite.
But you seem to be really, really threatening.
Watch out, man.
Looks like you could actually be a very good student.
I'm coming after you.
Maybe it is time, in fact, to pass on the baton.
Interesting. We'll talk about that.
And
a warm
why
welcome
not?
to you, all our Facebook followers are watching us live. Shaka Extra Time is a show that comes to you every Tuesday. Hello. So, Shaka, today we are talking about events that are happening in Russia for the first time. Probably in history, I don't remember or reading about something like this. The Russian government decided to invite African leaders for a summit. They're going to be there from tomorrow through Thursday. This is a remarkable development when you think about it, Shaka.
It is indeed remarkable, but in fact, it is probably not the first remarkable thing that has happened between Africa and Russia. It's probably a sort of reincarnation. As you know, of course, Russia, for a very long time, since the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, it used to be called the Soviet Union. And when you look at the role that the Soviet Union played in helping to liberate Africa, it was incredible, to the extent that they even, in fact, built a university to train people from the developing countries and especially Africa, to equip them with engineering skills, medicine, architecture, and you name it. And that university, guess what? That university was actually called Patrice Lumumba Friendship University in Moscow. It trained so many incredible people. One of the people that, in fact, trained in the Soviet Union, I don't recall whether it was specifically Patrice Friendship Lumumba University, was José dos Santos of Angola.
The former Angolan president.
The former Angolan president who pretty much almost became, in fact, a permanent president.
After nearly 37 years in power.
Well, you know, he followed a gentleman by the name Dr. Neto, a man who was very much liked, a man with humility and all that kind of stuff. But what happened, Neto died in office. And José dos Santos used to be the secretary of the MPLA and succeeded the late Dr. Neto and essentially, you know, stayed in the power since 1979 until recently.
Interesting. So was that something he learned from the Russians? Because it looks like President Putin himself has, in a way, figured out how to circumvent his constitution and hang around for a little bit of time.
It doesn't really begin with Putin, because, in fact, when you had the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 and Lenin, obviously helped by people like Joseph Stalin and all that kind of stuff, you know, you became president and replaced the Tsar. You sort of became like a presidential Tsar. There was no problem about tenure, about term limits and all that kind of stuff. You were supposed to be there to serve people, as it were.
Interesting.
It became, in fact, that is where most of Africa borrowed the concept of one-party state.
I'm not surprised. When President Vladimir Putin was announcing this summit, he sort of characterized, in one of his statements he made, he said that the West has been blackmailing Africa, and in his particular case, he's going to engage Africa directly without any preconditions. He says that unlike the West that puts certain conditions on their engagement with the West, so for him, it's going to be a blank check. I don't know how true is that.
I think it is very good news for the African rulers. Some call them leaders, but for the most part, apart from a few really, like for example, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, who subjects himself to an election that is widely, considered to be an election that meets the democratic international thresholds. Most are essentially rulers. And so I think that they should feel very comfortable to hear those types of words. But as for the people of Africa, it's quite a different ball game, really. Because let's face it, even Vladimir Putin, when you look at him and his rule and what have you, he doesn't seem to, frankly, be very, very much fated in Russia, as it were. Because, beginning with Boris Yeltsin, you had what appeared to be a democratic sort of transition. But it looks like it sort of actually became a reincarnation of the one-party state, or one-person state, for that matter.
Interesting. Let's go to Godson Tamin Brown in Blantyre, Malawi. What do you think the impact of Russia's engagement with African countries will be?
You know, I think that Russia is obviously looking for, especially two things. Is looking for minerals, for example, from Africa. It's also looking for a market. Russia, as I said, has really always been, engaging Africa, except that, history and politics had to force it to change a name that initially was associated with Russia, as I said, was the Soviet Union. Even though, of course, there were these other countries that were under that arrangement. And with the end of the collapse of the Soviet Union in around 1980, then it became essentially a sort of a federation republic of sorts. Yes, I think that it is good for Africa, as a matter of fact, to be in a situation where there is no particular country, no particular bloc that has a monopoly over interacting with Africa. So it's going to take smart African leadership to exploit those types of opportunities for the benefit of their own people. Because you're going to have the Russians, you're going to have the Americans, you're going to have the European Union, you have the Chinese. So it's up to a smart African leader who can, in fact, figure out a way, so long as they have the vision thing, and they can identify what they think is something that best represents the interests of their people, they can get it.
To borrow somebody's analogy, somebody has said that Africa is now like a beautiful woman, and everybody from all over the world is trying to court to do business or engage them at that level. But in fairness to Russia, this is not the first time they're doing, like you correctly said at the top of the show, this is not the first time they're engaging Africa. They have been doing it. As a matter of fact, they are selling arms to more than 30 African countries, and maybe to our disadvantage, these arms are being used against our own people.
Well, again, like I said, it will take a smart African leader to take advantage of these very unusual opportunities so that those African leaders can make sure that they get the best deal that will deliver goods and services to its own people. And that is possible. It's a question of having the right leaders. I think part of the problem of Africa, a lot of experts and observers have actually been pointing out, is what they characterize, not my words, by the way, their words, the essentially lack of really what you'd call committed, focused, and visionary leadership. And so they talk about really what you'd call about a scarcity of the right leaders, a leadership sort of deficit. Because Africa, as we've talked, is not poor as a continent.
But Shaka, to push back a little bit, some leaders on the continent, some leaders who have been there for some time, have argued that they're, for example, the best leaders to take Africa forward. They argue that they have the vision for Africa. They argue that they have the vision for their own countries to leapfrog Africa, maybe from a developing world to first world.
You see, sometimes there is a saying that talk can actually be cheap. There are some African leaders, as you rightly said, who have actually been in power for a very long time. In fact, you could even say a generation. But they have been basically talking the talk without walking that particular talk, so that their people can actually walk the walk. When you talk about Africa, you talk about the problem, frankly, of a leadership that is really focused. If you are somebody who, for example, has said that he is the only person, for example, who has the vision thing, the only person who can think very clearly about the direction where his country and his people can go. Somebody has been talking like that for 30 good years. When they talk again, please do me a favor. Ask them for the evidence. Ask them for the evidence which sincerely they can use to justify staying in power even for a second more, or a minute, or a day, or a year more, if in fact it isn't about themselves. Because power, the last time I saw, power is meant to be a force for good. And if it is meant to be a force for good, it means that it should actually make appreciable differences for your people. It should help, for example, to improve sincerely the quality of life of your people. But some of these people who we are talking about, without necessarily naming names, and I hope that they will listen to what we are talking about, and hopefully they will be able to learn some lessons and do the right thing. If you talk about how, for example, since the time I was growing up, I said that I had always heard my leaders, my elders, talk about how Africa produces what it does not consume and consumes what it does not produce. And somebody who was supposed to be smart came up and said, yes, all you need, all Africa needs is simply what they call adding value. And this particular individual in East Africa has actually been given a great opportunity, very rare, has actually been in a situation where he has been able, for example, to be part of what you would call the shifting of political constitutional goalposts, so that he can remove term limits, because limits can limit his performance and ability. But he's talking about adding value. Let's face it, man. How long does it take, sincerely, for you to talk about adding value and actually to be able to do it? If somebody has been in power for 30 years and more, and has only been talking about adding value, and yet, when you look at the ordinary people when they get sick, they cannot even go to a hospital or a dispensary with the hope that they can actually get some medicine and some decent treatment. When their children want to go to school to get some skills sets and all kind of stuff, they go to a school which is called, for example, universal primary education, or go to a school called universal secondary education. And guess what? This particular individual with his colleagues or cohorts cannot make the mistake of sending their own children or relatives to those particular schools. In other words, they have no confidence in actually what they are setting up for the rest of their own people.
So, Shaka, we have a lot of our comments are coming in. Let's go to Margaret Nanyonga. She says, isn't this neocolonialism? The fact that we are talking about Russia engaging Africa, isn't it neocolonialism?
No. What about Africa engaging the European Union? What about Africa doing trade and business with the United States of America, with Canada, with Brazil, with Turkey, with China? No. That is the reality of the world. There's nothing wrong in countries interacting, doing business together, so long as you know exactly what you want out of that interaction, and that what you want is something that you think is really in the best interests of your people.
Interesting. Let's move along. Let's go to Eric Kashambuzi. It is an African committed patriotic leadership that will make the difference, not natural, human, and strategic endowments. In short, it's the leadership deficit that is the problem. He seems to be agreeing with you.
It is very interesting that our views are on the same page, because when you think about it, Paul, we are not talking about rocket science here. We are talking about very basic things that are very important in every community that deserves dignity and respect. We come from Africa. We come from communities where we were raised, some of us, with parents who never actually had the dubious university education. But these people had character. These people had great integrity. These people had dignity. These people had values. And they were stars in their own community, respected, because they were basically good people. They delivered, they shared. You see, in Africa, there are a lot of people who are like that. The problem comes when you get people who are in control of this thing called the state, the government. They basically look out for their own interests. That is why sometimes I say some of these people who have the dubious privilege of running governments in Africa are patriotic, unfortunately, to their stomachs. The stomachs of their families, the stomachs of their friends, not society, not the country. What is needed is change for these people to be able to serve, because in fact, they are supposed to be servant leaders. Why do I say that? Because the bosses are supposed to be the ordinary people who are the primary stakeholders. These are people where there is an electoral environment, who actually wake up very early, sometimes spend hours and hours in lines to go and cast a vote to choose a leader. Unfortunately, in most African countries, that vote does not count. It doesn't really mean anything. Why? Because in most Africa, especially where you have leaders who have served for decades, they organize elections which they cannot lose. The reason is very, very simple, because at the end of the day, the results of that particular exercise or event are not reflections of the will of the people. Singularly appointed by the man in government to announce the quote-unquote right results, or the people, in fact, who count the vote. So that is the problem. That's the dilemma. The other thing is that, unfortunately, there is the absence of what I would call social. And it is not going to come like manna falling from heaven. It's not going to come like that. It is going to come if and when people have access to civic education, they get to know essentially what their rights are, and are able to mobilize and organize so that they can assert their rights.
Shaka, how would you respond to Jeffrey Einstein Mayanja? Distinguish between good and bad for their own people. They are just poisonous, like pythons.
You see, I don't think those are leaders really, because if in fact they are leaders, they should be able to look out for the interests of their people. Leaders, generally, the way it is, are not supposed to be very far away from their people. They are with their people and lead them to, or hope to lead them to, the social, economic, political canon, the promised land, to make a difference in their lives. You see, in countries which are developed, like the United States at one time, you have children. Those children are supposed to be better off than you, the parents. Why? Because they are supposed to climb on your shoulders, and once you succeed in climbing on somebody's older, who is older, their shoulders, you are able to see a little bit further than that particular individual. That is what the development is all about. Unfortunately, in a lot of countries on the African continent, I'm also not saying the entire African continent, but the vast majority of the African continent, unfortunately, it does have people who, sincerely, who we should start probably calling rulers. If we call them leaders, then probably we should actually say these are leaders who impose themselves upon their people. Because at the end of the day, there are no results really.
Yeah, let's go to Kanayo Okori. Why is it that these African leaders have the guts to go to countries like Russia for these big summits, but they're unable to emulate the development and industrialization in those countries and bring it back to their own countries?
I think, first of all, those people that he's calling leaders are probably not supposed to be in those positions to begin with. Because if, in fact, they were in those positions and they had what it takes actually to be leaders, they would be able to deliver to their people. But I think they have a different agenda. It's not about leading their people. It's about benefiting by exploiting their people. Look, for example, I would say, for example, like Uganda, for example. When you look at the healthcare system of Uganda, it stinks, to be honest with you. And yet, you know what? These people who are in control of government do not really suffer very much about that, because you know what? When they want to do medical checkup, guess what? They actually use the poor taxpayers' money to go to South Africa. And guess what? When they go to South Africa, guess who is the doctor who is attending to them? From Uganda. They go to the United Kingdom. They go to India. They come to America. When they get sick, and their families and their friends, they give them that money. That money does not belong to them. That money belongs to the ordinary taxpayer. But guess what? The ordinary taxpayer, when that person gets sick, where does he do? What does he do really?
They can't even afford to go to the hospital.
No, they can't. And then you have situations where, for example, a certain president in East Africa was able to send his daughter, who was pregnant but not sick, to actually go and give birth in Germany, which means he actually had absolutely no confidence in the entire medical system that he presided over. He did not have confidence in the doctors who were trained at Mulago, did not have confidence in the nurses, who are some of the best.
Well, when it comes to health, human health, it's up to an individual really to choose where they want to get their services. So, in fairness to that person you're referring to, I think it's in order for them to take their daughter anywhere.
I think you're right, but
I can choose to go to a private hospital rather than a public hospital.
You are right, so long as you are using funds or money which are drawn against your own particular bank account. But if in fact you are looking at a country as your basic bank account, sending a presidential jet, for example, that jet doesn't belong to you, it belongs to the people.
We have a short time to go. Really quickly, do you think aid, since we're talking about grants and aid coming from these developed countries to Africa, do you think, this is from Frank, do you think aid to Africa through loans and grants has led to stagnation?
Not necessarily that has led to stagnation, but maybe the question is, has it actually been utilized properly? Utilized in a manner, again, that in fact benefit the people? For the most part, it hasn't. And if it hasn't, the people who are in those positions sincerely should at least be sympathetic and empathetic with some of their own people who are doing the suffering for all of us. I mean, sincerely. If you have aid, for example, to train the young people so that they can get, like new skill sets in order to be able to get a job and put some food on the table and help their members of the family, and also contribute to the entire nation, surely then you should do that. If you have aid, for example, set up hospitals, please put hospital in place, put drugs there, have the doctors and nurses in place, trained in a manner to respect the people who are their bosses, because their bosses at the end of the day are the ordinary people. The primary stakeholders. And I think it is not going to happen until and unless you have ordinary African people getting the needed and adequate civic education, which clearly allows them to know what their role is, that they are citizens. And if they are citizens, they owe allegiance to the state, and therefore they have constitutional rights. They have inalienable rights or birthrights. But in a lot of these countries, some of these rulers who you say are leaders have actually removed that constitution and actually replaced it with personal manifesto.
Very briefly, what are you talking about tomorrow, Straight Talk Africa?
Tomorrow we are going to look at, unfortunately, the violence in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. You have a lot of people who are doing the dying and who running away from their neighborhoods because there is largely different ethnic groups like the Mai Mai giving hair to the Banyamulenge and what have you, and reports suggest that the government is basically just looking on.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time. It's been a pleasure hosting you. I look forward to hosting you on another edition of Shaka Extra Time. Until then, so long from Washington. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome.
And to you all, we thank you. Keep those comments